Good evening. We are about to start another lecture of the collaboration between the Japan House São Paulo and the School of International Relations at Fundação Getulio Vargas. This round of events brings together researchers from Japan and from Brazil to discuss some of the most relevant issues on contemporary international affairs. My name is Luana Geiger and I'll be hosting this event. Tonight we're welcoming Professor Dr. Yuka Fukunaga and Professor Dr. Carolina Moehlecke to present and debate on economic perspectives involving the Asia-Pacific region. I would like to invite Mr. Carlos Rosa, Executive Vice President of the Japan House São Paulo, to join us in the opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Luana. Thank you very much. Well, good evening, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here with you tonight. My name is Carlos, and I am the Executive Vice President of Japan House São Paulo. Just to give a quick idea, Japan House São Paulo is a project of the Japanese government that has as objective to present the modern Japan to Brazil, to Latin America, and also to some parts of Europe and the US. We opened Japan House São Paulo in May 2017, and after that we had our London branch and after the Los Angeles branch opened in 2018. And we try to reach this mission of presenting the Japan of the modern Japan with exhibitions, lectures, webinars, and all kinds of ways where people can have the contact with this fascinating country that is Japan. Japan House São Paulo is opened now, even with the pandemic, following all the procedures, all the points in order to give to our guests a safe visit. And we are also present on the digital, where we can find a lot of our contents. Nowadays, we are presenting a new exhibition, and we have a new one starting on mid of December. And we are opening this weekend one exhibition in Belém do Pará, in Casa das 11 Janelas. So you are all invited to know us physically or digitally. Well, I'd like to thank FGV for this invitation, for being here with you, to thank Professor Pedro and Professor Luana from the International Relations of FGV, Gabriela and Vanessa from our backstage, Professor Yuka Fukunaga, and Professor Carolina Moehlecke, and all the audience that are with us tonight. I hope you enjoyed this webinar, this lecture of International Economic and Trade in Asia-Pacífic region, and I hope you have a very good night with a lot of knowledge. Thank you very much, Luana.
Thank you, Mr. Rosa. As always, we highlight that all statements expressed during this event represent only personal opinions and not necessarily the institutional position of Fundação Getulio Vargas. Also, all present here have agreed to participate and have consented to be recorded in this broadcast, which will be later posted on FGV's official channels. The audience is encouraged to participate by sending questions during the event. Through the Slido platform, it can be accessed in the event description on YouTube. Tonight's main lecture will be given by Professor Dr. Fukunaga, Professor of the School of Social Sciences at Waseda University. She is a Doctor of Laws from the University of Tokyo and Master of Laws from the same university and also from the University of California. She received her Bachelor of Laws from Hitotsubashi University. She has been a government appointed collaborator to the International Law Commission in Geneva, a lecturer of the WTO capacity building seminars, as well as a visiting fellow at the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies, and also in Georgetown University. She has received the Waseda Research Award in 2017. Professor Fukunaga, thank you so much for joining us directly from Cambridge, in England.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. So may I share my screen now? Thank you. So today's topic for my lecture is Japan's trade and investment policy in the Asia-Pacific region. And since I have been researching on trade and investment policy, my focus will naturally be on that topic, but particularly in the Asia-Pacific region. And the structure of today's lecture is here. I start with an overview of Japan's trade and investment policy in general. And then I'll focus on trade and investment policy in the Asia-Pacific region. The main focus of my lecture will be on the second section, but I'll briefly touch upon a wider context of Japan's trade and investment policy in the multilateral context. And if I have time, I'll try to also speak a bit about Japan's trade and investment dispute settlement, because my primary research interest is on dispute settlement. So I'll try to mention some points related to dispute settlement. And I conclude my lecture by some remarks. But I understand that listening to an online lecture is very exhausting. It is exhausting to lecturers, but it's more exhausting to people who listen to the lecture. So what I'm going to do is to make my main points clear when I speak about the overview. And I also try to clarify my points in the section 5 when I speak about my concluding remarks. So, I mean, if you have time and if you are willing to, you can, of course, listen to my whole lecture. But if you're tired, perhaps you can listen to my overview section and the concluding remarks, and you can perhaps skip the other sections. But anyway, I'll try to present some interesting points and viewpoints that you could enjoy. Now, so I start with an overview, which is supposed to be the most important part in my lecture. And I think there are 3 key objectives in Japan's trade and investment policy. I should say maybe elements rather than objectives, but anyway, there are 3 key objectives. And the first is a rule-based. And many of you may remember that in the 1970s or 1980s, Japan was a frequent target of the United States unilateral sanctions. And well, in a way, the United States policy at the time is a power-oriented approach. The US used its economic power, political power to almost force Japan to accept trade restrictive measures, which may not be so legal. So, but in the 1990s, Japan's economic diplomacy shifted to the rule-based approach. And that is partly thanks to the establishment of the WTO. But since the 1990s, Japan has been making trade policies and investment policies in accordance with international rules. And Japan has been trying to settle disputes, trade disputes and investment disputes in accordance with international rules. So the rule-based approach has been the center element in Japan's trade and investment policy. And the second objective is multilateralism. And particularly in the recent years, especially during the Trump administration, we often heard the bilateral deals. But the centerpiece of Japan's economic diplomacy has been the multilateralism. Rather than having bilateral deals, Japan has been trying to make non-discriminatory multilateral rules. And as I will mention, the multilateralism is now at risk. But I think this element, this objective, remain at the center in Japan's policy. Third and finally, the strategic relationship. As you know, for Japan, the single most important ally is the United States. So in Japan's economic diplomacy, strengthening, enhancing the relationship with the United States is the most important objective. So these are 3 most important objectives. And to achieve those objectives, Japan has been using some key tools. And the first is, of course, the World Trade Organization, the WTO. As I said before, it's a multilateral organization, and it's a rule-based organization. So Japan's rule-based multilateralism can best be achieved in the WTO. But now the rulemaking functions, the dispute settlement functions of the WTO are having difficulties. The WTO has been failing to create new rules. And in the last couple of years, the WTO has been also failing to effectively resolve trade disputes. So we have to compensate these limits of the WTO's functions. And to do that, Japan has been concluding many bilateral and plurilateral trade and investment economic agreements. And those agreements are generally referred to as free trade agreements, FTAs. But the Japanese government has been preferred to use the term economic partnership agreements in order to emphasize that agreements that Japan has been concluding cover not only trade issues, but other economic issues such as investment and intellectual property rights. So, but I'm going to use the term FTAs because the FTAs and the EPAs are generally the same thing. So I'll use the term FTAs. But anyway, in Japan's policy, the government is using the term EPAs. And also there are international investment agreements focusing on investment issues. I'll speak about investment agreements a bit. And what I want to emphasize during my lecture is that although we cannot overstate the importance of the WTO and FTAs, we cannot ignore the emerging importance of non-binding instruments. And there are many non-binding, non-legal instruments to deal with trade and investment issues. So I'll come back to that matter during my lecture. So I'll briefly, or maybe I'll spend most of my time to explain Japan's trade and investment policy in the Asia-Pacific region. Well, I have to say that Japan is a relatively late comer in this field of regional agreements. And Japan's first FTA came into effect in November 2002, and it was concluded with Singapore. And so it's a bit late compared to other WTO members, but since then, Japan has concluded many FTAs with important economic partners. I'm not gonna read out the partners with which Japan has concluded FTAs, but as you can see in the slide, most FTA partners are situated in the Asia-Pacific region, ASEAN countries and so on. And among those FTAs, there are two most important FTAs, and I'm going to explain a bit about the two most important FTAs. The first is the CPTPP or TPP-11, and the other is RCEP, which will come into force in January 2022, which means next month. You may notice that there is a very important missing piece. Japan has not concluded an FTA in a proper sense until now. There are many initiatives with the United States, but there is no FTA with the US. So how can Japan sort of compensate the lack of an FTA is another issue that I'm going to address in my lecture. Now, so I'll speak a bit about the CPTPP or TPP-11. Historically speaking, it started as a very small trade agreement, which is called P4 in 2005. But the membership expansion negotiations started and the negotiations were joined by the United States, and Canada, and other countries, and also by Japan. And the TPP 12 was concluded in February 2016. But as you may know, during the US presidential campaign, the then candidate, Mr. Trump, pledged that the US would withdraw from the TPP if he was elected. And he was elected, and he made good his pledge. And in January 2017, the US withdrew from the TPP 12. So there is a risk that the TPP just disappear, but thanks to the efforts by the remaining 11 parties, and also thanks to the significant efforts by the Japanese government, the TPP 11 was signed in March 2018 and came into force in December 2018. And what was achieved by the TPP 11? Well, in terms of trade liberalization, the TPP has successfully liberalized not just trade in goods, but trade in services, and also it achieved, to some extent, investment liberalization. But I want to focus on the rules-related aspect. And there are many WTO, so-called WTO plus rules in the TPP. For example, there's a chapter on electronic commerce. There's very limited agreement on electronic commerce within the WTO, but there's a whole chapter in the TPP which covers many issues related to electronic commerce. And there's a chapter on state-owned enterprises, and also a chapter on labor and the environment. Let me say something about the state-owned enterprises, because it's one of the big concerns for Japan. And there is a concern that certain non-market economies have been intervening in market activities through state aids or state-owned enterprises. And that kind of, there are disciplines in the WTO agreement, especially in the subsidies agreement, which deal with such governmental intervention. But Japan, the US, the EU, and some other countries have concern that the subsidies agreements, regulations, disciplines are not sufficiently dealing with government intervention by certain WTO members. So this chapter in the TPP provides additional, more stringent disciplines to deal with state-owned enterprises. Now, the future of the CPTPP, I think the most interesting or important issue related to the future of the CPTPP is the membership expansion. First, whether the US returns to the TPP 11 or the TPP, and there's another issue of whether China will join the TPP or not. I'll come back to these questions later. Now I'll move on to RCEP. RCEP negotiations started in May 2013, and the negotiations started with Japan, China, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, and ASEAN 10 countries, and India. But unfortunately, India withdrew in November 2019. So the remaining countries signed the RCEP in November 2020, and it will come into force in next month. And the achievement, the overview, the result of the negotiations, well, if you compare the trade liberalization commitments or the rules, WTO plus rules in the RCEP to the TPP's achievements, we have to say that RCEP is relatively moderate compared to TPP. But the importance of the RCEP is that the text of the RCEP is not the end of the story. It's just the starting point. And the RCEP, the text of the RCEP, is expected to be a platform for future ongoing progressive development, liberalization. So it's just a start, and it's supposed to continue. And this progressive approach is one of the important features of the ASEAN countries. Actually, one of my friends in Singapore recently published a book on regionalism in Asia. And he said this progressive nature means that the RCEP may be believed to be led by China, but he says this is actually ASEAN-led agreement. In any event, about the future, we are expecting that RCEP will develop in the future. And another important issue that I want to make is that RCEP is, for Japan, the first FTA with China and South Korea. So although Japan has many tensions with China and South Korea, but those countries are very important economic partners, and the ties with China and Korea are very important for the Japanese industries. So RCEP is expected to strengthen the regional ties with those countries. The last point I want to briefly mention is the investment chapter in the RCEP. And well, I think I'm going to speak a bit about investment dispute settlement. The RCEP members could not reach an agreement on what dispute settlement to be included in the investment chapter. As I will speak shortly, in most conventional free trade agreements, there is a chapter on investment. And there is a system which is called investor-state dispute settlement. And in that system, an investor can bring a case against the host state, and that system has been used actively. But in the RCEP, there is no such system, and the parties so only promise to continue talks about the system. They just promise to continue to talk whether they want to include the system in the RCEP or not. I don't have a high expectation in that, and probably members cannot agree on the inclusion of the system, but this is the inclusion of this investor-state dispute settlement. It's a very important topic that we may want to discuss a bit more. So investment. Well, investment agreements can be concluded as an investor chapter in FTAs or EPAs, or it could be concluded as bilateral investment treaties. And generally speaking, there are three types of IIAs. And the most traditional, I would say the first generation of investment treaties focus on the protection of investment. And the second generation covers not only investment protection, but also covers investment liberalization. And the third generation is, I would call, advanced version of investment agreements. An advanced version includes, of course, it covers protection and liberalization of investment, but it also has provisions to clarify the meaning of the investment protection, how to what extent protection can be given to investors and so on. So the clarification is one of the features of the third generation agreements, and another feature of the advanced agreements is a balanced approach. The conventional agreements tend to focus on the protection of investors, tend to focus on an economic aspect of treaties. But the recent one, the advanced one, tries to balance between economic interest of investors and non-economic interest of the host country or the citizens in general. And many of the Japan's recent investment agreements can be categorized as an advanced version of investment agreements. Now, finally, investment dispute settlement. As I said, investor-state dispute settlement is the most frequently used dispute settlement procedures in this field of investment. But there are so many criticisms against this system. I don't have time to explain all the criticisms, but one criticism is that the system focuses too much on the protection of investors and neglect the importance of public interest. Another criticism is that the ISDS is not really consistent. And another criticism is that ISDS is biased. Arbitrators are not independent enough, and so on. So because of these criticisms, there is a proposal to create multilateral, sort of a permanent court system to deal with investment disputes. But the Japanese government and the Japanese industries are supporting the conventional type of investor-state dispute settlement. This is a bit interesting in a way, because not many Japanese companies are using investor-state dispute settlement. There are less than 10 complaints brought by Japanese investors. So, but in any way, it is believed in Japan that the ISDS is an essential part of the investment protection, and we have to have the system in FTAs and BITs. But since the criticism against the ISDS is growing, perhaps at some point, Japan may have to think about another option to settle investment disputes. Now, the US, the most strategic partner for Japan. As I said, the United States withdrew from the TPP-12 after Mr. Trump was elected as president. But now Biden administration came in, and there is a hope in Japan that the US might come back to the TPP. And in fact, Mr. Biden at some point indicated a possibility that US might consider coming back to the TPP. But at this point, that possibility is very slim, and we can't have a high hope on that point. So instead of hoping the US to come back, Japan did conclude a trade agreement. This agreement is not an FTA, but it's compared to other FTAs, the scope of the Japan-US trade agreement is quite limited. It liberalized trade, but only on certain products. And there is a clause in this agreement that Japan and the US will continue negotiations on trade, and this trade agreement was or is expected to be the first phase and expected to develop into the second stage or the third stage. But unfortunately, I think we probably cannot expect this trade agreement to develop into an FTA, or we cannot expect the US will come to the TPP-12. But there are many initiatives to deepen the geostrategic cooperation between the two countries. The Japanese government is promoting the vision of the free and open Indo-Pacific region, and Japan is trying to deepen cooperation, not just with the United States, but Australia and India. And some European countries are starting to participate in this strategy. And here I want to emphasize that in the recent years, we can see from this sort of initiative that now trade issues are not just trade. Trade issues are so closely connected to national security issues. I think in the past, we tended to separate trade issues from other political issues or national security issues. And by separating trade issues from national security issues, political issues, we can have legal binding agreements like FTAs or GATT or WTO. But in the recent years, we are no longer able to separate trade issues from national security issues. And in that kind of circumstances, it's getting more and more difficult to agree on legally binding agreements, treaties. So I think under the such circumstances, we have to think about other options. We have to think not just legal trade agreements, but we have to think about more informal frameworks to deepen the cooperation between the two countries. Now, China. There are many concerns about China in Japan. China is making a national security threat for Japan. And as I mentioned earlier, the Chinese government has been intervening in market activities in the country through its state-owned enterprises. Or the Chinese government provides extensive amount of industrial subsidies to its industries, and sometimes the Chinese government is providing subsidies to other countries' companies. And those subsidies, those kinds of governmental intervention, are, in Japan's view, creating trade distortion. And as I said earlier, Japan, the US, and the EU are now trying to sort of create some mechanism to deal with such trade distortive activities. And also in terms of natural resources, well, Japan is very much dependent. Well, the dependency rate is decreasing, but still Japan is very much dependent on natural resources of China. And that dependency creates a security issue. And once Japan has some issue with China, China may restrict or prohibit the export of natural resources to Japan. And that would be a huge issue for Japan, for the Japanese industry. So, and also human rights issues. There is an allegation, or there is evidence, or there is concern that the Chinese government or Chinese local governments are engaging in human rights violations. And so Japanese industries are now trying to make sure that there is no human rights violation in their supply chains. But anyway, that's human rights issues are another concern about China. And for Japan, the US-China tension is creating a concern. Well, the US is the most important strategic partner, but still China is also important economic partner for Japan. So while maintaining and strengthening ties with the United States, we have to develop economic relations with China. So it requires a very delicate balancing consideration. So, well, there are concerns, but as I said, economic ties with China are very important. And since Japan has concluded RCEP with China, that will help Japan develop economic ties with China. But the remaining issue may be whether China will join the CPTPP. And some people may say that, well, it's impossible because there are very stringent rules in the TPP, especially on state-owned enterprises, and China cannot accept those stringent rules. But I don't necessarily agree with that kind of view, because the TPP has stringent rules, but at the same time, the TPP has flexibilities. So at least legally speaking, I think there is a possibility that China can join the TPP 11. And also economic realities. Many TPP parties have strong economic ties with China, although China is a concern to many countries, but still China is a very important economic actor. So given those economic realities, some of the CPTPP parties may have a desire that China, if China joins the TPP, that could be economically beneficial and so on. So we cannot underestimate the possibility of China joining the TPP, but of course, politically speaking, it's not feasible, especially for Japan to allow China's accession. So in conclusion, for Japan, China cannot join the CPTPP, at least politically speaking. But as I said, economic realities, or legally speaking, we might have to consider the possibility of China's joining the CPTPP. Now, Japan's trade and investment policy in the multilateral context. As I said at the beginning of my lecture, the multilateralism is a centerpiece of Japan's trade and investment policy. So ideally speaking, if rules are made in the WTO context, if trade disputes, investment disputes, those disputes are settled in the WTO context, that may be better. And Japan has been making efforts to make rules in the WTO context. For example, Japan has been very active in the electronic commerce negotiations, and Japan has been leading some initiatives to deal with non-market government intervention. And there are also climate change negotiations and so on, and dispute settlement. Now WTO dispute settlement is at crisis. But to solve that crisis is another important objective for Japan. But now that the MC12, the ministerial conference, was postponed, unfortunately, due to the new variant of COVID, I have to say this postponement will definitely reduce the momentum in the WTO negotiations. But given the importance of the WTO negotiations and WTO dispute settlement, we have to keep trying to revitalize WTO. Now, Japan's trade and investment disputes. Well, in terms of trade disputes, Japan has some trade disputes with China and Korea. With China and Korea, Japan has anti-dumping related disputes. And with Korea, Japan has a dispute regarding export control measures. But I haven't talked much about WTO dispute settlement, but the WTO dispute settlement is now dysfunctional in a way. So we cannot expect WTO-DS to solve these disputes with China or Korea. But RCEP will come into force next month, and probably we may have to think about using those regional FTAs to solve disputes, those disputes. But at the same time, there are disputes which have political context, which have a national security context. And WTO-DS, or trade dispute settlement, is not a proper forum to such political disputes. So like I haven't talked much, but Japan has an export control measure related dispute with Korea. And it is a very politics related, national security related dispute. And that to solve that kind of dispute, we have to think about using non-judicial conciliatory dispute settlement mechanisms. Investment arbitration, I said already, although Japan has been supporting investment arbitration, Japan has been supporting investor state arbitration. Perhaps we might think about other options to settle investment disputes as well. Finally, concluding remarks. So if you skip the preceding sections, you have to come back and you have to start listening to my lecture again. So the rule-based multilateral approach has been the centerpiece of Japan's diplomacy, and the WTO was and is and will be the most important forum, and to sort of compensate the limits of the WTO, to compensate the difficulties of the WTO, we have to conclude FTAs and EPAs, and the FTAs and EPAs have become an essential tool for Japan. So those tools to pursue the rule-based multilateral approach are very important, but at the same time, we have to use a bit different approach. And as I have been saying, trade issues, investment issues are very closely connected to other issues. This trend is very evident in the recent years, but trade issues are closely connected to national security issues, and they're closely connected to climate change and now the health issues and so on. And those interconnected issues, I think, cannot be properly dealt with by legally binding rules, agreements, treaties. And we have to have more informal, policy-oriented approach. Perhaps policy-oriented approach may, to some extent, replace the rule-based approach. And in terms of dispute settlement, in the past, dispute settlement is to solve disputes by applying the existing rules. But these days, many rules are arising where there's no rules. So we cannot solve those disputes by applying the existing rules. And we have to think about different approach. Perhaps we have to have conciliatory approach. We have to have a mechanism to prevent dispute from arising and so on. In any way, legally binding dispute settlement may become a bit obsolete. The last point is the stakeholders' involvement. In the past, I think we tended to focus too much on agreements, and agreements are concluded by governments. Only governments can negotiate those legally binding agreements. But at the end of the day, trade is important for industries, and we have to have a mechanism to sort of incorporate stakeholders, industries' involvement, and also citizens' perspectives and so on. That kind of a broader involvement will be important in the years to come. Thank you very much for your attention. And that concludes my presentation.
We thank Professor Fukunaga for her enlightening presentation. I would also like to remind our audience to send their questions through the link available in the description of this lecture. And without further ado, I introduce our commentator, Professor Dr. Carolina Moehlecke, Professor of the School of International Relations at Fundação Getulio Vargas in São Paulo. She earned her PhD in Political Science from the University of Texas at Austin, with emphasis in international relations and methodology. Professor Moehlecke also holds a master's degree in political science from the same university and a bachelor's degree in international relations with distinction from Centro Universitario La Salle, which included an academic exchange period in Argentina. She has also been awarded the Best Dissertation Award by the International Collaboration Section of the American Political Science Association in 2019. Professor Moehlecke, it is a pleasure to host you, and thank you very much for joining us.
Well, thank you very much, Luana, for this kind presentation, for the opportunity of being here today. And thank you, Professor Fukunaga, for a very rich and interesting talk. I think that one point that really stands out from your presentation is that for already quite some time now, we cannot analyze trade and investment separately, right? We see multinational corporations investing abroad to establish efficient supply chains and engage in trading intermediates in addition, but actually much more than trading finished goods. And as you mentioned, most trade agreements include an investor-state dispute settlement clause, which highlights this complexity of the global economy we have these days. And Japan in particular has many relevant global value chain firms that are the central actors of this process and reconciling strategic interests of governments with the business interests of these firms might be challenging sometimes. I think the point that you make also that we cannot separate trade issues from national security issues is extremely relevant these days, right? Trade is also about key geopolitical aspects. And I think for a very long time, the international relations community liked to think about international and trade investment as being about cooperation. But now it is about cooperation, but nowadays it has been increasingly clear that there are also vulnerabilities, and it is also about this political tensions. Specifically, you mentioned regarding Japan, the political tensions with China and South Korea, which are very important for economic integration for the Japanese economy and the Japanese firms. And we have all these tensions building up in the context of a crisis of multilateralism, like you mentioned, and a move towards more bilateral level or regional level diplomatic tools. And we had been witnessing these developments for a while, and then you add the COVID-19 pandemic to this scenario, and we have one situation that perhaps it's one thing that we can elaborate on now in this debate, is one effect of some economies or some governments trying to enact policies to allow for some reshoring of their production, right? So some governments trying to enact policies that will facilitate the comeback of production from other countries to back home, right? And I think at the beginning of the pandemic, there was a lot of discussion on the Japanese government policies for reshoring of offering subsidies to bring production back home and attenuate dependence on production, specifically in China. I have been following this story and would love to hear your comments on this. How is this reshoring process happening? If it is happening, the last comment I think we can see is that it has been developing slowly, with some firms pulling out production from China, reorganizing their supply chains, but not a lot. And in the meantime, you add this pressure for reforms of investor-state dispute settlement, which I'm glad you brought it up during the presentation, that Japanese businesses, they value those investor-state dispute settlement clauses, even though they're not frequently used, right? I actually checked the numbers today again, and Japanese investors have initiated, I think, only 6 cases that we know of, which contrasts very strongly with other large economies that have investors that have used these clauses much more often. And I wonder, and would love to hear your thoughts too, whether this seemingly underutilization of investor-state dispute settlements clauses could be partly due to the active participation and involvement of the Japanese government in preventing disputes before they arise, or settling them before they reach the stage that they become actual disputes. And I guess to just wrap up on this thoughts, right? You see on one hand this process and this pressure for reshoring and attenuating vulnerabilities in a world where trade is a geopolitical issue. You also see the crisis of multilateralism. You see developments at the bilateral level, but you also see a lot of pressure for reforms of some of those bilateral institutions, like bilateral investment treaties and the investor-state dispute settlement rules, right? The UNCITRAL working group number 3 has a process ongoing to renegotiate those rules. And Japan is one of the countries that hasn't publicly voiced strong opposition to the system, which contrasts with other countries like Australia, an RCEP partner that is very vocal against the system, right? Because they have been targeted very strongly. So I guess in the end, the question is, first, how do you see this development of reshoring and bringing production back home, if it is happening at all, or if this has been overstated somehow? And how do you reconcile this with Japan's movement, or Japan moving forward with agreements like the CPTPP and the RCEP? And if reshoring is indeed moving forward, do you think this process could lead to more disputes, could bring Japan more into this picture of litigation at the international level? Or what do you see happening instead? I guess that would be an interesting way to complement your already very rich presentation. So thank you.
Thank you very much for the very insightful comments, and I'll try to respond to as many points as I can. Trade and investment, the connection, the relationship between trade and investment. Well, I think you made a very good point that those two subjects are closely connected and cannot be separated. But as a lawyer, I think I find it very interesting that trade legal regime and investment legal regime are developing in sort of two different ways. Trade is dealt with mostly by WTO and by mostly by WTO and to some extent by FTAs, while investment treaties are made in a bilateral basis, and dispute settlement as well. Trade dispute settlement is dealt with in the WTO, while investment disputes are dealt with through investment arbitration. And despite the closeness of the subject, those two legal regimes have very limited contact with each other. So that's in a way interesting to me, but it's not appropriate to deal with these issues separately. And personally, as a researcher, I try to explore how these two different regimes can learn from each other. For example, what is interesting is that in the trade regime, now we are discussing that the appellate body, an appeal system, has not been properly dealing with disputes, while in the investment field, they're speaking about how to create a new appeal system and so on. So that contradiction is quite interesting. But given the similarity or closeness of these two subjects, we probably have to think about how to deal with the two subjects in a consistent manner. And the national security is again connected to trade, and that makes the situation even more complicated. But reshoring, well, unfortunately, I think COVID-19 highlights the risk of offshoring production in overseas. And I'm aware that some companies started to reshore its production sites. But my sort of impression is that this trend will not continue forever. If you reshore production sites, for example, to Japan, the production cost will increase, and that is not economically efficient. And so there is a trend right now to reshore some production sites, but that is not sustainable, I think. And I haven't heard any disputes that arises from that kind of a reshoring. And that also leads me to another question about investment dispute settlement. And you asked why there are very few investment disputes brought by the Japanese investors. And I think there is a general hesitancy not just among Japanese companies, but Japanese people in general to use judicial mechanisms to settle disputes. So not just investment arbitration, but commercial arbitration cases are very, very limited compared to other countries, other regions. So I think many companies, many investors prefer to settle disputes in an amicable way, and they try to avoid judicial settlement. Having said that, so again, it's a bit interesting that despite the limited number of cases brought by Japanese investors, still the Japanese government or the Japanese industries are supporting this investor state arbitration system. Well, I think there may be a bit, well, if I may say, lack of experience, lack of knowledge on the part of the Japanese industries. And there is belief, which is not necessarily justifiable, but there is a belief that this kind of investor state arbitration system is essential to protect their investment overseas. So perhaps we have to provide more information to the Japanese industries, and we have to tell them that there are other options, other channels to settle investment disputes, and we have to tell them that how problematic investor state arbitration could be. I think I cover most of your comments, I think.
Thank you so much to both professors for this opportunity for exchange. We have a few questions from the audience and we have time to take a couple of them. So the first one asks if Professor Fukunaga believes the US-China trade war and competition had an impact on the Japanese trade approach, and if so, how? I'm going to send this question written in our chat so you can check it.
Of course, the US-China trade war, trade conflicts affect Japan. And as I said, while the US is the most important partner, Japan has to maintain its economic ties with China. But the US, well, I think the same applies to some extent to the US, and the US cannot really decouple China from its economic relations. But still, when the US sort of imposing sanctions against China and pressuring US's allies to sort of, in a way, keep distance from China, it's getting very difficult for Japan to keep ties with China. So it's definitely impacting Japan's policy, and we have to balance. I mean, we have to try to maintain good relationships in a way with both sides, and that's definitely complicated when two sides are fighting each other, you know.
Thank you, Professor. And our last question. Professor Fukunaga mentioned the need to structure a more informal, policy-oriented approach to the multilateral forum of negotiations. How does the Free and Open Pacific FOIP strategy converge with this idea, if so?
Well, the Free and Open Pacific strategy is one of the informal strategies. It's not seeking to create a legally binding system. It's an open-ended initiative, and it can, as I said, expand not just Japan, Australia, US, and India, but it could expand. Expand relationship connections with European countries. And the subjects to be dealt with in this initiative can be also open-ended. Well, it started as a sort of a national security initiative, but it can touch upon vaccination issue. It touches upon climate issues and so on. So this kind of initiative can be used as an informal policy-oriented framework to address those emerging issues in a more flexible way. If we have to agree on a legally binding agreement, we have to have long negotiations. We have to have a sophisticated text and so on. But this kind of initiative can be very flexible, can be address new issues in a flexible manner. So I can this strategy can definitely converge with the policy-oriented informal approach. Yes.
Thank you, Professor. As we approach the end of this lecture, we would like to thank once again both professors, our audience, and the Japan House São Paulo for supporting this event. Our closing lecture of the year will take place on December 8th, next Wednesday, with Professor Moehlecke's presentation. Thank you very much, everyone, and have a great night.
Thank you.